Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is still December of 2018. Now, since I actually happen to have a background in this area, I thought it would be important today to take a look at what is called the replication or reproducibility crisis within science. My academic studies focused on history and philosophy. I had a special interest in what is called the history of ideas and a subset of that called the history of science. So I think that particularly suits me well to look at this particular issue to find out if there actually is a crisis within science or not. Now, there have been a number of studies that have come out over the last 5 to 10 years showing that there seems to be a large amount of corruption within science and a number of other problems that have emerged within science because of external or outside influences. That would be related to money, related to funding, related to various interest groups that have involved themselves within the scientific process in order to disrupt it, shall we say. Now, we always have to understand that there is a gap between the ideal and the real. So the ideal here that we would aim for, of course, would be objectivity and as much as possible neutrality. Now, objectivity does not always necessitate neutrality. A lot of people seem to think so. They're actually wrong to think that. But the thing that we have to have here is we at least have to have objectivity in terms of the methodological process or the procedures that we follow in order to arrive at particular results. So that process that we would have that we would refer to here in this instance would be the scientific method itself, which generally is thought to be comprised of about 4 components. However, I would actually like to add several addendums to that to sort of help the process overall. And in fact, this would agree largely with what Karl Popper himself added on to the scientific method. The 4 primary components of the scientific method, which hopefully you were taught in elementary school, middle school, and high school, is generally made up of these 4 aspects. It begins often with a conjecture with certain sets of observations and measurements that are made about something in the external, observable, objective world. The next phase would be a hypothesis phase, where you start to set out various theories or hypothetical explanations regarding whatever it is that you happen to be addressing. Say how do the ocean currents form, and have they ever been different in the past, or will they change in the future, something like that. The next phase you would have would be making a series of predictions. These could be either inductive or deductive reasoning predictions about whatever it is that you happen to address. And the final phase would be an experimental phase where you put to test whatever it is that you have conjectured and hypothesized about and made predictions about. Now, to this, I would add that it's very important to have a replication phase where these same studies are conducted by other people who have various different sets of interests than you happen to have, and perhaps they come up with the same results or different results. That's where we get this replication crisis problem that I'm talking about. Then the next part, you would have verifiability. That would be if you're actually confirming these results. And then you have a falsifiability aspect. Are you disconfirming the results? Falsifiability being far more important really than verifiability, but verifiability also still of import, as we shall see as we get into some of these articles. And just to dig down a little bit deeper into definitions here, we'll take a look at the concept of falsifiability. So first of all, your statement or conjecture or hypothesis has to be stated in a way that actually can be tested, and not just by yourself, but by other people. So let's say you say something very basic, such as all swans are white, or all horses are faster than all dogs. Well, this is something that you can go out into the real world and actually put to the test, and then you'll find out that newborn horses aren't as fast as some adult dogs, or injured or sick horses are not as fast as certain dogs, or something like that can actually be tested. This is sometimes also referred to as the refutability criterion. This falsifiability criterion is one that separates it from rank speculation or pure hypotheticals, such as how would planes operate in the realm of Middle Earth. Well, there's no way to go out and test that. No one has any idea. That's just spitballing late at night while you're smoking weed in the dorm room or something. The verifiability criterion, or what is sometimes referred to as verificationism, simply means that the statement has to be one which is, at least in principle, somehow empirically verifiable or testable in order for it to actually be a meaningful or scientific statement. And it was Popper who came along and actually modified this by adding in the falsification aspect. Now, within the history of science, there's a very important book that many people have heard of but don't really know anything about, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And basically what Kuhn argued within this book is that scientists work within basically a series of what he called paradigms. They work within a sort of worldview that allows in certain types of information, but sort of has a filtration process that keeps out other types of information. That is, until a certain number of anomalies build up, and then eventually you'll have a change of theories. These change in theories, though, actually usually take place among younger scientists. It sort of happens in history as well. You'll have younger historians come up with new ideas to explain anomalous data or anomalous evidence, but really what you ultimately have to do is wait until the older generations die off so that the older paradigms can then be moved out of the way to open up space for a new set of paradigms to come in and start to work on new problems, new questions, and to try to resolve whatever these anomalies were that had built up over decades or centuries before. For as important as this book has been over the years, it also comes up really short, though, in actually accounting for certain other aspects of change within the domain of science. And really what it has done is it has lent itself far too much into the hands of the postmodernists who want to say that, well, we should be skeptical of all knowledge. We can't really know what is true and what isn't true. This is where you have so many people come in who are subjectivists and relativists, and they use Kuhn's book as, sort of a center point for how they'll argue that. They'll say, well, even science can't get these things right. Even science doesn't know what the truth is. And, science is sort of the, ruling conceptual foundation for our modernist era and postmodernist era, which is a reaction against the scientism of the past. And I think it's also important to note that Kuhn himself was not one of these extreme epistemological relativists either. He did not fall into that camp. He was simply trying to make a historical argument about how science has actually operated rather than this idealized concept that you would be getting out of a textbook. And the final thing that we need to consider before we jump into this is something referred to as Occam's razor, or the so-called law of parsimony. Now, it isn't actually a law, it's more of a rule of thumb, sort of a kind of guideline that scientists often use. And this law of parsimony is usually attributed to the Franciscan friar known as William of Occam, who lived in the 13th and 14th century. He was a philosopher and theologian. And basically what he said was that if you have a series of answers to a particular question that are offered, it's usually the simplest one that is the correct one, or should be taken to be the correct one, so far as it can account for all of the available evidence, all of the available data that is being brought to bear on that particular question. So the most common way that Occam's statement is phrased goes like this: entities are not to be multiplied without necessity. However, I would say that the group of scientists who get into the most trouble with this particular aspect, with parsimony and with Occam's razor, would be cosmologists, because cosmologists have a number of problems when they're attempting to account for the very beginnings of time, for the beginnings of existence, for the beginnings of the Big Bang, for the universe itself. So they'll multiply entities very commonly to infinite degrees. So they'll say that there are an infinite number of universes, there are an infinite number of multiverses, time is infinite. They start to appeal to all kinds of infinities in order to attempt to account for the beginning and for the currently known size and age of the universe itself. This is also a problem for theoretical physicists who often appeal to, say, M theory or hyperspace theory, where they say that there's an infinite number of strings, basically, that are the smallest level of all existence. There's a infinite number of dimensions and all of this sort of thing. They have to appeal to this replication of entities that are far beyond what anybody would ever call parsimonious. But that is also why they're hard at work at trying to formulate the grand unified field theory in order to account for all of these multiplicities and sort of boil it down to one very basic and elegant formula that can be summed up basically like E equals mc squared or something of that manner. That, however, takes us a little far afield from what I want to address here, which is the replication crisis or reproducibility crisis. Now, this is known as what is called a methodological crisis, and it primarily seems to apply to the social sciences, such as psychology, psychiatry, medicine even, which is probably the most frightening one overall. So just as an example, in 2016, the journal Nature published the results of a poll of 1,500 scientists that showed that 70% of them had failed to reproduce at least one other scientist's experiment. 50% even had failed to reproduce one of their own experiments. In 2009, 2% of scientists admitted to falsifying studies at least one time, and another 14% admitted that they personally knew of another scientist who did falsify the result. This basically falls into the category of misconduct or fraud, and this seems to be most common within medical research, according to all of these polls and studies that I've been taking a look at, and I'll link several of them below so that you can look at them yourself. And it appears that the most egregious and repeat violators are often found within social psychology, where people have even been found to fabricate data entirely, to conduct fraudulent research, publish fraudulent results, and so forth. Some of this is also found within areas where you have conflicts of interest, such as Monsanto having some of their products tested, and then it comes out inevitably with the results that say, well, it's totally fine. Nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. Don't worry about the frogs with 5 legs or 3 eyes or anything like that. No concerns there. Just go ahead and take your Monsanto. You can drink a cup of it if you like. You also have the same problem on the other side, where Planned Parenthood or the NRA will pay for certain studies, and then they'll come up predictably with results that are favorable to their organizations and what they want to take place. These are things that are very difficult to guard against, but they are an inherent and repeated problem within science. Another problem that causes this is that within academia, basically the push is always to publish or perish, and because you always have this sort of pressure on you, no one really wants to replicate the studies of other researchers. If they're going to look at it at all, it will be because they're motivated to sort of overturn it. Rarely will they go in to simply confirm what is quote-unquote already known to be true. And also, there are not very many rewards if you do something like that. You're not really going to be on a tenure track position if you're just going out and retesting things that other people have originally tested already. This is sort of looked at as like, you're forming your little brick that you're going to add to the wall or whatever. That's basically what you do with your master's degree and your PhD anyway, is sort of begin to form your own brick that goes into the wall of so-called knowledge. But specifically to take a look at medicine just for a moment, we find that the cases of non-reproducibility and fraud are particularly bad in cancer research. It's something that should be really frightening to everyone. It says here, out of 49 medical studies from 1990 to 2003 with more than 1,000 citations, 45 claimed that studied therapy was effective. Out of these studies, 16% were contradicted by subsequent studies. 16% had found stronger effects than did subsequent studies. 44% were replicated, and 24% remained largely unchallenged. From 1977 to 1990, the FDA found flaws in 10 to 20% of medical studies. But a very frightening study that was published out of the University of Texas in 2012 found that only 11% of the preclinical cancer studies that they had looked into could actually be replicated. In 2015, a work was published by Glenn Bagley, probably not related to Ed Bagley Jr., I would presume, and John Ioannidis, who offered 5 different bullet points where they could summarize the present predicaments related to the replication crisis. They said that 1. Generation of new data and publications is happening at an unprecedented rate. 2. Compelling evidence that the majority of these discoveries will not stand the test of time. 3. The causes, failure to adhere to good scientific practice, and the desperation to publish or perish, which I just mentioned. 4. This is a multifaceted and multi-stakeholder problem. And 5. No single party is solely responsible, and no single solution will be able to suffice. So the first article that we will take a look at is by Manya Baker from May 25th of 2016. This is the one from the journal Nature. The headline, 1,500 scientists lift the lid on reproducibility. Survey sheds light on the crisis rocking research. More than 70% of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiments, and more than half have failed to reproduce their own experiments. The data reveals sometimes contradictory attitudes towards reproducibility, however. This is very bizarre here. Listen to this. Although 52% of those surveyed agreed that there is a significant crisis of reproducibility, less than 31% think that the failure to reproduce published results means that the result is probably wrong, and most say that they still trust the published literature. Now, is that not a case of cognitive dissonance or what? Why would you trust it when it can't be replicated? And you even admit at a high rate that it can't be. And when you actually dig down into the results, what I found here is that 90% do agree that the reproducibility crisis actually is a problem, a significant problem for science and for scientists. On the low end, only 3% say that there is no crisis whatsoever. 7% say they don't know. I guess these people probably sleep on the job and don't actually do any studies or experiments anyway. So those who don't know, let's just say we don't really care what they think anyhow, right? So we have 3% who say there's no crisis whatsoever. But over 90% admit that yes, it is a problem of either slight or significant. But this powerful article continues here. It says, data on how much of the scientific literature is reproducible are rare and generally bleak. The best-known analyses from psychology and cancer biology found rates of around 40% and 10% respectively. That is absolutely tragic and nightmarish. Now, this next section is of extreme import, and I want you to pay really close attention to this no matter where you lie on the climate change issue. Now think about what is being said here. The results capture a confusing snapshot of attitudes around these issues, says Arturo Casadeville, a microbiologist at Johns Hopkins. He says, quote, at the current time, there is no consensus on what reproducibility is or should be. But just recognizing that is a step forward, he admits. He continues, the next step may be in identifying what is the problem and to get a consensus. Okay, so now when you hear the media repeatedly battering you over the head saying that it is a consensus of scientists who believe in AGW, anthropogenic global warming, or climate change theory, think about this. I mean, how does that gel with this microbiologist telling you that scientists among themselves cannot even come to a consensus to understand what reproducibility is? One of the most basic elements of science at all. So if they can't come to a consensus on that, how do they magically jump to a consensus on these other issues, which are massively, massively complicated? It's just food for thought. Now, as we go down deeper into this article on page 5, at least on my printed off sheet, it's 5 out of 13. I don't know what it will be online when I link it for you, but it'll be there. It says here, have you failed to reproduce an experiment? Most scientists have experienced failure to reproduce results. And it breaks it down by various categories, such as chemistry, where they say that someone else's study they were unable to reproduce. Over 80% have experienced this failure. I will continue to go through these here. In biology, almost 80% have failed to reproduce someone else's experiment on at least one occasion. Physics and engineering, almost 70% say this has happened to them. In medicine, almost 70% again say that has happened to them. In earth and environment, about 63% say that they have been unable to reproduce the experiments of someone else. The next section is, have you ever tried to publish a reproduction attempt? And in terms of a successful reproduction actually getting published, the publication rate is only 24%. So even if you are able to reproduce it, most of the time they're not even going to give you the time of day. Now on page 6, under corrective measures, it says here, 1/3 of respondents said that their labs have taken concrete steps in order to improve reproducibility over the last 5 years. Rates range from a high of 41% in medicine, where they actually decided they needed to make some changes, to a low of 24% in physics and engineering, where basically they're like, yeah, our bombs are still blowing up and our bridges stand, so we're good here. But to me, I think the most surprising aspect is that 34% admit that where they work, whatever lab it is or institution, has actually made no changes whatsoever to enhance reproducibility possibilities. And there's a section over on page 9 that has some interesting results that are also kind of funny when you think about it. So it says, what factors contribute to irreproducible research? And the top one was selective reporting. 2, the pressure to publish. A little bit further down, you have fraud, which ranged anywhere from a low of 40% of cases to 70% of cases. And the lowest one they have here is actually, they say, they're not able to reproduce because of bad luck. Now, you would think that materialists, naturalists, reductivists wouldn't even believe in a concept such as bad luck, but that actually ranged almost as high as 40% of respondents are like, yeah, we couldn't reproduce it because of bad luck. Whatever the hell that actually means, I don't know. And a bit later, they asked them what factors could boost this reproducibility issue to help it out a little bit. It says better understanding of statistics was one of the top responses. Also, incentives for better practices and incentives for formal reproduction, because there's actually not really anything out there that helps to enhance these sort of do-over attempts. The next article that I will look at is from the BBC, from their science section, from their science correspondent, Tom Fielden. This is from February 22nd, 2017. Headline, most scientists can't replicate studies by their peers. So I'll just read a few select portions from this here. It says, from his lab at the University of Virginia Center for Open Science, immunologist Dr. Tim Arrington runs the Reproducibility Project, which attempted to repeat the findings reported in 5 landmark cancer studies. The idea here is to take a bunch of experiments and try to do the exact same thing to see if we can get the same results. However, as I skip down a bit here, it says the team was able to confirm only 2 of the original studies. 2 more proved inconclusive, and then the 5th, the team completely failed to replicate the result. It's worrying because replication is supposed to be a hallmark of scientific integrity, said Dr. Arrington. According to the survey published in the journal Nature last summer, more than 70% of researchers have tried and failed to reproduce another scientist's experiments. Continues a bit further down. For its part, the journal Nature is taking steps to address the problem. It's introduced a reproducibility checklist for submitting authors, designed to improve reliability and rigor to the process. And now we come to the twist, where a sort of a wrench is thrown into the whole thing. This is from Science Daily, from March 3rd, 2016. Headline, researchers overturn landmark study on the replicability of psychological science. Summary, an in-depth examination of a 2015 landmark study showing that more than half of all psychology studies cannot be replicated has revealed serious mistakes that make its pessimistic conclusion completely unwarranted. This is from Harvard University. So on what is my page 2 here, it says, according to 2 Harvard professors and their collaborators, a 2015 landmark study showing that more than half of all psychological studies cannot be replicated is actually wrong. In an attempt to determine the replicability of psychological science, a consortium of 270 scientists known as the Open Science Collaboration, or OSC, tried to replicate the results of 100 published studies. More than half of them failed, creating sensational headlines worldwide about the replication crisis within psychology. It says here, Gilbert, King, Pettigrew, and Wilson discovered that the low-fidelity studies were 4 times more likely to fail than were the high-fidelity studies, suggesting that when replicators strayed from the original methods, they caused their own studies to fail. Like most scientists who read the OSC's article when it appeared, Gilbert, King, Pettigrew, and Wilson were shocked and chagrined. They began to scrutinize the methods and reanalyze the raw data. They immediately noticed problems that started with how the replicators had actually selected the 100 original studies in the first place. What they did, added Gilbert, is to create an idiosyncratic, arbitrary list of sampling rules that excluded the majority of psychology subfields from the sample, that excluded entire classes of studies whose methods are probably among the best in science from the sample, and so on. When they did their calculations, they failed to consider the fact that the replication studies were not just new samples from the same population, they were often quite different from the originals in many ways, and those different sources are a source of statistical error. Gilbert noted that most people assume that a replication is a replica of the original study. Readers surely assume that if a group of scientists did 100 replications, then they must have used the same methods to study the same populations. In this case, that assumption would be quite wrong. Replications always vary from originals in minor ways, of course, but if you read the reports carefully, as we did, you discover that many of the replication studies differed in truly astounding ways, ways that make it hard to understand how they could even be called replications. I think that the big takeaway point here is that meta-science must still obey the rules of science, King said. All the rules about sampling and calculating error and keeping experimenters blind to the hypothesis, all of those rules must apply whether you are studying people or studying the replicability of science itself. Meta-science does not get a pass. It is not exempt. And those doing meta-science are not above the fray. They are part of the scientific process. If you violate the basic rules of science, which I reviewed at the beginning of this so that you would have those down pat before you get here, you get the wrong answer, and that is what happened here. And as we come towards the conclusion here, I will reference you to the original article, or at least one of the many original articles that related to that first study that was being re-examined. This is from the Smithsonian.com. It's from August 27, 2015 by Brian Henwerk, and it says, scientists replicated 100 psychology studies and fewer than half got the same results. The massive project shows that reproducibility problems plague even top scientific journals. He begins here, academic journals and the press regularly serve up fresh helpings of fascinating psychological research findings, but how many of those experiments would produce the same results a second time around? According to work presented today in Science, fewer than half of 100 studies published in 2008 in 3 top psychology journals could be replicated successfully. The international effort included 270 scientists who reran other people's studies as part of the Reproducibility Project within psychology led by Brian Nozick of the University of Virginia. And I also want to point out here that the scientists who did review Mr. Nozick's work here went really out of their way to basically not sling too much mud at him. You know, I think several of them are actually friends with this Brian Nozick fellow, and they didn't want him to come out looking too bad because they were saying basically that his team had not done work that was as good as it could have been, shall we say. But this short little article continues here. It says, this project is not evidence that anything is broken. Rather, it's an example of science doing what science does, says Christofferson. He's one of the research team members. It's impossible to be wrong in a final sense in science. You have to be temporarily wrong, perhaps many times, before you're ever right. And the concluding paragraph says here, unfortunately, there are disincentives to pursuing this kind of replicability research. To get hired and promoted in academia, you must publish original research, so direct replications are rarer. I hope going forward that the universities and funding agencies responsible for incentivizing this research and the media outlets covering them will realize that they have been part of the problem and that devaluing replication in this way has created a less stable literature than we would like. And I think that is a good way to wrap up this overall video and podcast here, because I agree with that conclusion, even though this particular study may not actually have been correct. And I would also like to point out that the ones in medicine, particularly the ones around cancer research, are the most serious, and it does seem that there is a significant problem with cancer research and within medicine as a whole, even if psychology and psychiatry maybe is not as bad as some of these outrageous headlines over the last few years have made that out to be. But I hope that in this video, maybe you learned a little bit about science, about the procedures and methods involved in science, about the question of objectivity and neutrality, which people often confuse and sort of overlap and run one into the other. But as I look forward to the new year, there are many, many other topics that I want to address, some in depth, some not so much in depth, but always related to history, philosophy, science, history of ideas, things of that nature. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.